The content in this video is for general educational use. It does not represent political opinions or judgments about any country, culture, or government. Information is based on publicly available sources and may be summarized or simplified. Viewers should verify details through multiple sources.
When you think of World War II, a lot of major stories probably come to mind. But what about the stories that were intentionally buried? Today, we're going to talk about one of those, an ordeal hidden for decades by shame and official denial.
So, this really brings us to a tough question. We're diving into a painful chapter of history, one that was silenced for almost half a century. And it really makes you wonder, what is the price of that silence? And how do you even begin to find justice after so long?
Okay, so to really get our heads around how something like this could even happen, we've got to rewind. We need to look at the world it happened in, a world where Asia was basically a chessboard for powerful foreign empires. For hundreds of years, you had these European powers operating under this idea called colonial paternalism. Basically, the thinking was, hey, we're doing you a favor. We're bringing you civilization and good government. But of course, this was really just a justification for conquest, for total control, and for stripping these places of their wealth. And you have to understand, these weren't just your average companies. You look at something like the British or Dutch East India companies, they were practically governments in their own right. I mean, they were building empires, they were waging wars, and they were pulling out incredible amounts of wealth. They really set the playbook for how to do this. And who was taking notes on this playbook? Japan. They saw what the Europeans were doing, and as they modernized and built up their military, they started to build their own empire, using that same model to expand across Asia, often with even more brutality. And that imperial expansion, well, it led to something truly horrific. It led to the creation of one of the biggest, most organized systems of sexual slavery in modern history. Now, the official story, the justification that was given for creating these so-called comfort stations, was that it would stop soldiers from committing random acts of sexual violence. They also said it was about controlling the spread of STDs. But let's be clear about the reality. It was a system of institutionalized, military-controlled rape. For a long, long time, the Japanese government insisted that private business owners were running these places. But then, military documents started to surface, and they tell a totally different story. You look at regulations like this one, and there's no question, the military itself started it, approved it, and controlled the whole thing. And here's where you see just how cold and bureaucratic the cruelty was. The military regulations actually spelled out payment rates for the soldiers. And look at this, they created a clear racial hierarchy. Japanese women at the top, Korean women in the middle, and Chinese women valued the least. It's all right there in black and white. So you have that cold, detached bureaucracy on one hand, and then you have this quote from a former pilot. It just shows you the brutal reality behind the paperwork. It perfectly captures the absolute dehumanization that was at the core of this whole system. Okay, so we've talked about the system, but now we need to talk about the people. For the women and girls, and there were hundreds of thousands of them, who were forced into these stations, the horror didn't end when the war did. It was just the start of a lifetime of pain. These women and girls, like Kim Bok's son, they came from all over the territories Japan occupied, and they were taken in the cruelest ways. Some were tricked with promises of good jobs in factories, and many others were just kidnapped, snatched right from their homes. And then, after the war, what happened? Silence. For decades, survivors like her had to live in total isolation. They couldn't tell anyone their story because of this huge social stigma. This crushing sense of shame that had been forced on them, a shame that was never theirs to carry. And we have to remember how young they were. I mean, so many were just teenagers. Some were so young they hadn't even started their periods yet. Just children. The trauma was just constant. Every single day they endured rapes, beatings, and horrific injuries. And the army doctors, they would usually just ignore their pain. The only time they'd really step in was to do checkups. And that wasn't for the women's health, it was to make sure disease didn't spread to the soldiers. So when the war finally ended, you'd think there'd be some relief. But no, the Japanese army just left them there, abandoned them. And for those who managed to make it home, they often faced a whole new nightmare, a lifetime of physical pain and psychological scars. And so often, they were rejected by their own communities.
And it's so important to grasp the sheer scale of this. Look, we'll probably never know the exact number, mainly because so many records were intentionally destroyed. But historians estimate that somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 women and girls were forced into this system. Just try to imagine that number.
So their ordeal didn't just stop in 1945. What followed were decades of silence. But eventually, that silence was broken. It gave way to a fight for justice, for acknowledgement, a fight that's actually still going on.
Think about it. For more than 40 years, the world basically forgot about this. It was swept under the rug. It wasn't until the early 90s that the first survivors started to bravely, and I mean bravely, speak out. And that's when the real fight for recognition kicked off.
And the response from the world has been, well, complicated. You can draw a pretty stark contrast with Germany, right? Germany has paid massive reparations for Nazi crimes. But the Japanese government's position has always been that all the legal claims were already taken care of in post-war treaties. That means no direct compensation has ever been paid to these individual victims.
And trying to get justice is made so much harder because of missing evidence. Why? Because at the end of the war, a lot of the key documents were deliberately destroyed. So for an individual survivor, trying to prove her case in a court of law becomes an almost impossible task. So all of this leaves us with one last really difficult question. Today, there are only a handful of survivors left, and they're getting older. For them, still waiting for a real apology, for some kind of meaningful justice, what can that even look like when the world took so long to even start listening?